Hello and welcome to the History of the Germans, episode 234, The Charisma of Emperor Maximilian. Maximilian I died on January 12, 1519, but his likeness is still everywhere. None of his predecessors had left behind as many depictions of their life, from being fed by his nurse as a toddler to the Totenbild, the picture of the emperor in death, stripped of all his paraphernalia, even his teeth broken out. If you search in Google for the most reproduced image of a Holy Roman Emperor, two come up. The portrait of Maximilian that Albrecht Dürer produced in Augsburg in 1518, that was the one that was shown in last week's episode artwork, and Titian's equestrian portrait of Charles V after the Battle of Mühlberg, which in turn is a composition that goes back to several equestrian portraits of Maximilian I. Basically, Maximilian I is the most visually present Holy Roman Emperor of them all. And that is not by chance. As he said on several occasions, quote, "Whoever does not provide for his commemoration during his lifetime has no commemoration after his death and is forgotten with the sound of the bell that rings at his burial." End quote. The celebration of his memoria, his remembrance, was a major preoccupation of the emperor. It is the kind of thing many of his contemporaries worried about a lot too, and the way they tried to leave an indelible mark on their nation's consciousness was through buildings. His French contemporaries, starting with Charles VIII but really culminating with François I, built castle after castle in the valley of the Loire. Amboise was Charles VIII. Louis XII built the castle at Blois, and the jewels in the crown, Chenonceau, Chambord, and then a bit further afield, Fontainebleau, were the dreams made stone of François I. Grand buildings to memorize great and even not so great leaders became a French obsession that gave us Versailles, the Arc de Triomphe, and the Centre Pompidou. Maximilian's ally and sometimes friend Henry VIII tried to match François on the field of cloth of gold, and his palaces at Whitehall, Nonsuch, and then later Hampton Court. The will to turn memory into tangible objects is what gave us the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, the Stanze of Raphael, the Palazzo del Te and the Camera degli Sposi in Mantua, Michelangelo's David, and the frescoes of the Doge's palace recounting victory after victory. The most recognizable construction that Maximilian left behind that is still standing is the Goldene Dachel in Innsbruck, a highly decorated balcony on the side of his imperial palace where he could watch tournaments and festivities. There was also a Wappenturm, a tower decorated with 54 coats of arms of territories that Maximilian I did or hoped to rule at some point. Now, both of these were attractive landmarks, but not quite the Mona Lisa. But do not let yourself be fooled by this. Maximilian had a great eye for art and artists, and he employed Albrecht Dürer, Hans Burgmeier, Albrecht Altdorfer, Veit Stoß, and dozens more. But instead of asking them to produce grand buildings that he could neither afford nor transport, his focus was on works that could be replicated and displayed all across his far-flung empire. Works on paper, works that could be printed and sent to everyone in his realm, or even beyond. Now, some of these works we've already encountered. There's the history of Friedrich III and Maximilian that Joseph Grünpeck put together. Grünpeck was a secretary at the court of Maximilian, as well as a popular writer and the founder of a Latin school in his hometown of Regensburg. And his book tells the story of Friedrich III and Maximilian up to the year 1505, roughly, the end of the War of the Landshut Succession. Now, this work, written in Latin, is a case of more or less accurate historiography, of course flattering, but a fairly usual product of the times. The illustrations, however, were drafts produced by a young artist from Grünpeck's hometown of Regensburg, Albrecht Altdorfer. These were meant as sketches for later woodcuts that could be included in a printed version of the book. But as it happened, the project dragged on until Maximilian's death and was abandoned and only rediscovered in the 19th century. So at the same time that Grünpeck was still working on his history, Maximilian had shifted his focus to a similar project, the Weißkönig. Like the history, it was meant as a guide for Maximilian's successors, specifically for Charles and Ferdinand, who were growing up far away, Charles in the Low Countries and Ferdinand in Spain. The idea was to impart the knowledge and the virtues needed to be a successful ruler. And it might be that the fictionalized account in the Weißkönig was a better way to drive this story than the rather checkered set of events that marked the reigns of Friedrich III and Maximilian. In the Weißkönig, Maximilian appears as an insufferable swot who excels at every form of learning before becoming the world's most successful military genius. Despite the constant betrayal by his rivals, the kings are usually referenced by a confusing set of colors and heraldic symbols. That being said, the Weißkönig gives us a great insight into Maximilian's character and worldview. There are the usual allusions to Arthurian legend and the emphasis on chivalric ideals that was the mainstay of aristocratic education since the High Middle Ages, but then there's a lot of focus on science and technology. The young prince was to learn about mathematics, astronomy, the production of armor and artillery, and good administration. For the Weißkönig, the project progressed further than the history. Over 250 individual woodcuts were created, and the text, much of it dictated by Maximilian himself, was nearly completed in 1519. However, it did not progress to a final edit and printing, and it took until 1775 before it was finally published. A similar fate befell the Freidal, the tournament and party book Maximilian had conceived in 1502. I absolutely love the beautiful colored drawings of the knights hitting each other over their heads with deadly weapons and then party hard in the evenings. It is quite romantic that these images show Maximilian trying to prove his worth to Marie of Burgundy in all kinds of playfighting, when the love of his life was well over 30 years dead by the time the last ones were made. Again, the manuscript dictated by Maximilian and the images weren't published until 1880, and there's an amazing edition as a coffee table book by Titian made in 2019 that my lovely wife gave me for Christmas. So, how were these books supposed to be used? I envisage a more intimate environment. In case of the history and the Weißkönig, the intended main audience were Maximilian's grandchildren, again, Charles and Ferdinand specifically. So you can imagine a tutor reading the Weißkönig to Charles and urging him to learn about military tactics and administrative reforms, as well as gaining the moral fiber to live a good life. These were books intended to educate future princes and rulers in what is important to fulfill their destiny. Maximilian may have wanted for these books to pass through the generations and maybe also spread across to other leading families in the empire. However, because they weren't printed, that never happened. But it happened to the Theuerdank, the only one of the books in this vein that was published. In this long poem, Maximilian casts himself as an itinerant knight, once again trying to earn the hand of his beloved Marie. Now, this book has fewer illustrations, 111 in total, but by the same artist that worked on the Weißkönig, Hans Burgmeier and Leonhard Beck. The first print run was in 1517, a lavish version on vellum that Maximilian sent round to his friends and most important German allies. But in 1519 he authorized a much larger and much cheaper print run on paper, and after his death multiple unauthorized copies circulated. Now today the Theuerdank is remembered mainly for popularizing Fraktur, the typical German typeface. Whilst elsewhere in the world older typefaces that mimicked the writing of medieval scholars were replaced by Roman script or Antiqua, in Germany Fraktur, as developed under Maximilian I, was used well into the 20th century, although only ever for German language texts. And this typeface has gone out of fashion almost completely, except for some very traditional brands and extreme right-wing propaganda. The latter is, by the way, another total misapprehension, since it was the Nazis who in 1941 ordered the replacement of Fraktur in all official documents by modern Antiqua-based typefaces. But the impact of the Theuerdank goes well beyond the typeface. Now the term that is most associated with Maximilian I is the last knight. The notion of Maximilian as, the final manifestation of an ancient chivalric culture has a lot to do with the way he presents himself in the Theuerdank. He is the hero who deals with the various threats he is exposed to with wisdom and determination. And many of these threats are rather mundane, like the household traps and hunting accidents his enemies set up for him. Hence, despite his exalted status as a romantic hero and, thinly disguised emperor, he is also relatable to the reading public. And though it comes in the guise of a 14th century rhymed chivalric romance, it's also modern in the sense that the lady at the heart of his quest is not passive, but the one who demands for him to come to her and defend her kingdom, very much like Marie of Burgundy had done. And if you look at the pictures, Theuerdank appears in the same kind of armor as Burgmeier had depicted Maximilian in the classic 1508 image on occasion of his elevation to the imperial title, and in his design for an equestrian statue. Now, the image of the emperor in 1508 has a complementary picture of St. George, again in very similar garb and very similar armor. And so gradually these two figures, the emperor and the saint, fuse into one. So unsurprisingly, some artists took the idea one further. Daniel Hopfer was the first to depict Maximilian as St. George himself, and a 1522 limestone relief shows Maximilian as St. George with dragon underfoot. Such direct associations between a donor and a saint, in particular an important saint, were actually quite rare. There's Lorenzo the Magnificent being shown as one of the three magi, but that was in a private chapel of the Palazzo Medici Riccardi, not in a public space. Usually, princes were shown as secular figures, like, for example, as Alexander the Great. Or they were shown as donors alongside the saints, or maybe as kings David or Solomon. But I can't think of a case where a donor had himself painted as the patron saint of chivalry himself. If you can think of one, let me know. So I could go on about Maximilian and St. George. For instance, he commissioned a printed prayer book for his chivalric Order of St. George that contains, again, designs by Albrecht Dürer that then reappear in one of Dürer's most famous woodcuts, Night, Death and the Devil. But I guess you get my drift. All these woodcuts and books created this image of Maximilian as a brave knight, a powerful killing machine tamed by the love of his lady, who directs his strength to the protection of the widows and orphans and the defense of Christendom, which then leads straight to the recurring theme of the Crusades we discussed last week. But like Maximilian himself, his image is not just about the glorification of a lost chivalric age. He's not just the last knight. Maximilian was at the same time a military innovator who tried to keep his forces at the forefront of the latest technological developments. And one artifact that shows this in simplistic clarity is the Zeugbuch, an inventory of the imperial armory in Innsbruck. Hundreds of pages depicting cannon, howitzers, arquebuses, serpents, culverines, falcons, siege guns, and. This book was never published and was never intended to be published. Assuming it was an accurate listing of the weapons in the imperial armories, well, it would have been classified information. What Maximilian may have used it for was to convince allies or potential allies to come along on his madcap adventures. He would have shown them pages from the book, and given his thorough understanding of the strategic and tactical value of each piece, he could then also explain how they are used, produced, where and how many he could have made within what time frame. In other words, it was a political tool that could be immensely powerful. He might have picked up the idea for such a device from his youth when Charles the Bold showed him his military instruction manual that likely contained images of his fabled armories. Whilst this material was kept under lock and key, Maximilian's artists produced and distributed woodcuts depicting his wars in great detail. There have been woodcuts for almost every single battle we mentioned in the last 18 episodes. And to put that into context, for all the previous emperors and kings of the Romans, such images are actually extremely rare. The wars of Henry VI in Sicily are probably the most detailed depictions. And then Villani provides illustrations for key events in the life of Frederick II. But nothing as prolific or detailed had been produced before, let alone printed and distributed. And in these images, the focus is on the forces that actually won the battles. The infantry with their pikes as well as the artillery. It is no doubting that the days when the men on horseback, the knights, won the wars alone was over. Moreover, there are images of Maximilian chatting with his Landsknechte. They appear in processions, and as we heard, when Maximilian marched into Ghent, he marched on foot with his men. So much for the last night. What Maximilian was trying to do with this apparent contradiction was to transport the positive things of the past, the chivalric code of honor and the obligation to protect the helpless, into the world of modern warfare. How that looked in reality, well, consult the previous 18 episodes. What we're talking about today is the image that Maximilian created, not the reality. And the image is both the last knight and the father of the Landsknechte. Now, Maximilian started seriously considering the way he would be remembered in his early 40s, around 1500. And as his physical body began to deteriorate and he had seen his son perish in Spain, the process went into overdrive. All these various projects were pursued in parallel, artists working on several books at the same time. Woodcuts, texts, and ideas were shifted from one to the other. Around 1512, Maximilian devised his most ambitious publication scheme yet, the Ehrenpforte, the Arch of Honor. Now, this wasn't a book, but a gigantic woodcut measuring 12 by 10 feet, 3.5 meters wide, 3 meters high, and made up of 36 sheets. These sheets were supposed to be cut up and then pieced together and attached to a flat surface, a board or a wall. The Metropolitan Museum in New York owns a complete set from the first edition, 1517-18, and has created a digital image of an assembled Arch of Honor. If you go to the episode webpage, you can see the image and a link to the mat. Now, I'm not sure it is particularly beautiful, but it's definitely impressive. The starting point of the design was a Roman triumphal arch, like the Arch of Titus on the Forum in Rome. But it became soon obvious that such a structure was not able to contain all the complex narratives Maximilian and his team of humanist scholars were aiming for. So the arch morphed from a somewhat rectangular piece to a gigantic tower that was simultaneously tall and wide, with 3 gates at the base. The idea was that these sheets would then be sent out to the princes and cities in the empire as well as foreign dignitaries, who would then set aside a space in their palace or city hall where it could be displayed to the court or the city council. What the admiring public would be able to see on the Arch of Honor are all the reasons why Maximilian was the rightful emperor. So, starting on the furthest left side, you have the line of his predecessors going back to the Roman emperors via Odoacer, Theodoric, the Hohenstaufen, Salian and Ottonian emperors. Meanwhile, on the furthest right-hand side, you have the contemporary princes and kings allied and related to Maximilian. So that includes Ferdinand of Aragon, Ladislav of Hungary, Sigismund of Poland, Eric of Denmark. A full complement of prince-electors, but also other princely supporters and cousins like the Duke Eric of Brunswick. Then there are 4 columns that break up the wall where the saints of the House of Habsburg are displayed. Now, moving further towards the center from both sides, we have 24 woodcuts, 12 on either side, showing key elements in the life of Maximilian I. All his major battles, as well as the 3 important marriages, his own to Marie of Burgundy, Philip and Joanna, and the Hungarian double wedding. And then in the very center, above the actual gate of honor, is the family tree of the House of Habsburg, as imagined or designed by the court historian and mathematician Stabius, and framed by the coat of arms of all the territories the family ruled or thought it ruled. This family tree of the august House of Habsburg is shown to go back to where they all go back to the city of Troy. But there is a big difference here to the traditional Troy narrative. Most other European monarchs and emperors trace their lineage back to Troy in line with Virgil, aka they went from Aeneas to Romulus to Julius Caesar to Constantine to Charlemagne and then up through whichever line they followed. Maximilian does claim a relationship to this line, but all these emperors are shown on the further left side, not in the center. In the center, his family tree goes back not to Aeneas, but to the son of the Trojan hero Hector. And that son made his way to Pannonia, which is Hungary today, and there his descendants then defeated the Sicambrians. I've never heard of those guys, but they're apparently a precursor of the early Franks, and then the Franks took over Gaul. The individual name is kept a bit fuzzy on account that these guys had all been heathens. So the individual ancestry really only starts with the first baptized of those, Clovis, and then meanders up to Clothar, Childebert, Theodebert, and then on to the, somewhat less well-known Otbert the Honourable, Bobo the Strong, Rothar the Gentle, and Ethelbert the Warlike. And then after a bunch of Humfrieds, Ludgards, Guntrams, and so forth, we hit some actual Habsburgs in the form of Radebot and Werner, who we made way back in episode 203. And from there, it is a lot more realistic, and also the depictions become a lot larger, giving prominence then to Friedrich III, his wife Eleanor of Portugal, then Philip the Handsome and his wife and children, and, atop of all of it, Maximilian himself with his two wives, his beloved Marie of Burgundy and the not-so-cherished Bianca Maria Sforza. Now this is really the most striking element of this whole construct, because what he and the team of humanists and artists he employed are doing here is rebasing the legitimacy of the Emperor Maximilian. All his predecessors have based their authority on the line of medieval and Roman emperors going all the way back to Julius Caesar and Aeneas and Troy. And sure, Maximilian does that too, but they're not, as I said, at the center. They're coming up on the side, which means they are less important. In fact, they're exactly as important as their counterparts on the opposite side, which are the friends and relations of the emperor, going down from Ferdinand of Aragon, Sigismund of Poland, Ladislav of Hungary, to the electors and selected princely cousins. So no, Maximilian describes his legitimacy as coming predominantly from being a member of the Habsburg family, the House of Austria, and moreover, this authority, though originating from Troy like that of the other emperors from Augustus to Frederick Barbarossa, his line came up through Central Europe, through Hungary and Germany, not through the Mediterranean and Rome. It is a very deliberate setting aside of key imperial traditions and exchanging them for a dynastic idea. The idea that the Habsburgs have been masters of Central Europe since forever and ever, and that their destiny is set against the Romanized French in the West and the Muslims in the East. Now, before we bring it all together, there's one last image in this gigantic picture, which is the top of the tower, where we see Maximilian seated in some sort of mansard window set into the grand cupola. There he sits, holding a staff with a snake coiled around it, and wearing a crown that has, and there's really no other word to describe it, has a bird nesting inside it. Then there are a bull, a lion, a rooster, a crane, a falcon, a dog, and some naked human feet unconnected to any body. This image traces back to, and I'm not making this up, ancient Egypt. These attributes relate Maximilian to Hermes Trismegistus, who, if you are a very keen listener to this show, you may remember from episode 188. This figure was a combination of the Greek god Hermes, hence the staff with the coiled snake, and the Egyptian god Thoth. I can't really pronounce it, it's Thoth or Thoth. Anyway, he's the one with a bird in the crown, an ibis. And this figure, this Hermes Trismegistus, he supposedly had written down all the wisdom of the world that God had actually passed on to Adam just before these two fell out over his dietary habits. These wisdoms, also known as the prophecies of the Sibyls, was an extremely popular text in the Renaissance. Gutenberg had printed them, and the famous floor of the Cathedral of Siena puts Hermes Trismegistus at its center. There's a whole host of what is called Hermetic literature that interprets and adds to these texts. The fundamental idea behind them is that all knowledge and religion stems from one source, and it is deeply connected. Ancient philosophers like Zoroaster and Plato were just forerunners of Jesus Christ, whose appearance Hermes Trismegistus had foretold in detail. That concept also included ideas about astrology and alchemy, and then in particular the philosopher's stone. Or you might know the term hermetically sealed. Well, that comes from a technique developed by the alchemists seeking the philosopher's stone based on the writing of Hermes Trismegistus. Of course, all this stuff turned out to have been entirely faked and was revealed as such in 1614 and consequently completely forgotten, except by nerds like us. But in 1515, when Maximilian and his team conceived the Arch of Honor, it was pretty much mainstream and riding high. And by placing himself atop of everything disguised as Hermes Trismegistus, he completes his narrative. And that narrative says that he is, in ascending order of significance, the successor of the ancient emperors, supported by the kings and princes of Europe, blessed by the family saints, the victor in dozens of battles and master of marriage diplomacy, the descendant of the august house of Habsburg that ruled Central Europe since the dawn of days, and the wisest of men who holds the strings of knowledge that pulls the world together. Modesty is not a virtue that featured much on the Arch of Honor. But as my grandfather used to say, Bescheidenheit ist eine Zier, doch weiter kommt man ohne ihr, which roughly translates as, a modest man is usually admired, if people have ever heard of him. And have people heard of the Emperor Maximilian? His publication drive did imprint his image, or more precisely, the image he wanted us to see in the collective memory. But it did go beyond the memory of Maximilian as an individual. It shaped the perception of the Habsburg dynasty all the way to its end. Max Weber, and I'm sure you guys have been wondering when I will release him into the podcast, Max Weber, founder of modern sociology, argues in his famous speech about politics as a vocation, quote, "As a matter of principle, there are in fact three intrinsic justifications underpinning the basic legitimacy of any political dominion. First is the authority of the eternal yesterday. This type of authority is based on conventions which possess validity through habitual attitudes towards keeping sanctified customs. But in addition, there is authority which is based on a special personal spiritual gift, charisma, which is reflected in a personal dedication to and a personal trust in revelation, heroism, or other traits characteristic of a leader. Finally, there's authority of effective dominion based on legality, the belief in the validity of legal statutes, which is justified by rational rules, professional competence, and modern civil servants." End quote. So basically, according to Weber, authority as a basis of legitimate power can come from three sources. It's either on tradition, on the law, or personal charisma. If we look at Maximilian I, we can see the vast deficit he had to deal with right from the beginning. Let's start with tradition. The Habsburg Empire that emerged under his grandsons Charles and Ferdinand was a brand new entity. Sure, the individual components, Austria, Tyrol, the Grand Duchy of Burgundy, Aragon, Castile, Bohemia, Hungary, and of course the Holy Roman Empire, all had long traditions of rulership. But they were all different. Some were elective monarchies, some had automatic succession from father to son, others allowed female succession. As for Maximilian himself, he inherited authority only to Austria and Tyrol. As for all the rest, namely the Empire and the Low Countries, his authority was derived from election or guardianship, and in Hungary and Bohemia he had only very limited influence based on the 1491 treaty, and in Spain none at all. And even more limited was his ability to derive authority based on the law. As regards the reign of Maximilian I, things varied dramatically again from one territory to the other. The Grand Dukes of Burgundy had established one of the most sophisticated bureaucracies, system of law courts and tax authorities in Europe. But that system was almost completely abolished when Marie of Burgundy had to grant the great privilege to the Estates General after her father's death. It took decades of work, in particular by Philip the Handsome and Margaret of Austria, to rebuild this structure. As for the Austrian lands, Maximilian did establish a modern treasury and administration for his family estates with its headquarters in Innsbruck. And as for the Holy Roman Empire, as we have discussed in episodes 223 to 226, the imperial reforms left the sovereign with very limited influence. Given Maximilian could not rely much on tradition, and even less on the institutions, in particular not on those of the Holy Roman Empire, at least by Weber's definition, he had to drive hard for charisma, for the personal appeal of him as an individual. So that is where the Theuerdank and the Weisskönig, as well as the various depictions of his battles and marriage diplomacy, come in. He convinced his audience, at least posthumously, that he was the last knight, the reincarnation of St. George, out on a quest for decency and love, and at the same time a man of science, a military leader who embraced new technologies and established the new, ultimately most powerful fighting force in Europe, the Landsknechte. Some of these perceptions began to percolate across the German lands during his lifetime, but the big publication push came only towards the end of his life, in 1517-18, and therefore too late to endow him with actual authority. But quite a lot of it rubbed off onto his successors. The Landsknechte reached their peak at the Battle of Pavia in 1525, i.e. under Charles V, and were suitably celebrated. When Titian painted Charles V at the Battle of Mühlberg in 1548, that image had again strong references back to the equestrian portraits of Hans Burgmeier that had been published and distributed widely. But that is not where it ends. The most enduring component is that central panel of the Arch of Honor, the Habsburg family tree. The territories this dynasty ruled over the centuries have no language in common. They are different cultures and traditions of rulership. They are not even geographically coherent. All they have in common is the fact that they are ruled by the same person or a close family unit. By effectively inventing this genealogy of the Habsburgs, going back not to Rome and Charlemagne, but to a Central European narrative set against that tradition, or in more tangible terms set against France and the Ottomans, he created the mortar that held the empire together. It is, of course, all made up, but it held. Maximilian's successors inherited and continued to build on this charisma, as Weber would call it, and invented traditions. His grandson Ferdinand completed Maximilian's cenotaph in Innsbruck, where again the Habsburg ancestors, real and imagined, and now male and female, take center stage, much larger than the Roman emperors and even the saints. Whilst Maximilian in knightly armor kneels before the altar, and the panels below him tell of his wars and marriages. Up until today, the Habsburgs are seen as a dynasty that is incredibly ancient and venerable. Its monarchs, benign rulers who continuously strove for peace and decency. The truth is, there are 13th century upstarts who made up letters from Caesar and Nero and who fought incessant wars and cared very little about their subjects. Okay, on the latter point they may have not been much worse than the others. But still, this narrative of the benign emperor and his ancient bloodline is what held the Austro-Hungarian Empire together throughout the 19th century, despite the rising nationalist movements. Those works on paper, much less awe-inspiring and recognizable than Versailles or the Winter Palace, did a better job at keeping their creators in power than those did. And as we have seen time and again, Maximilian was a traditionalist, dreaming of being Lancelot, St. George and Godfrey of Bouillon, all wrapped into one, but at the same time an innovator and a disruptor who found ingenious ways to deploy the latest technologies for his purposes. However, the same year that the first prints of the Arch of Honor had been distributed, someone else was using the printing press in an even more astute way for his political purposes. Martin Luther. His 95 Theses had their first print run of 300 that same year of 1517, and by 1520 there were hundreds of thousands of his various pamphlets circulating. Before we close this chapter, we have to mention the Triumphal procession, which, like the Arch, was project managed and partially designed by Albrecht Dürer. It has much the same themes as the Arch of Honor, though rather than reimagining a Roman triumphal arch into the Renaissance, this is a translation of a Roman triumph into the world of Maximilian. And it's even bigger, 54 meters long. And it has some of the same pictures. But this time riders or Landsknechte hold up panels with the depictions of the great battles. and the imperial family moves on triumphal carts and reenact their marriages. There's also a cart full of musicians, a theme I simply do not have the time to elaborate on here, but that also has a lasting connection with the Habsburgs. What I would like to draw your attention to is the very end of the procession, where you find the people of Calicut. Calicut is the Indian city of Kozhikode in the Indian state of Kerala. This was the main spice exporting hub that Vasco da Gama visited. Hans Burgmeyer's imagination of the people of India bears no resemblance to contemporary Indian fashion, largely because he chose to depict them as half-naked savages. But still the message is clear. Even the people of far-flung India we have never seen and who ride on elephants, they were to be subjects of the Habsburg emperor. Though such an assertion was clearly preposterous when made about Maximilian, who could barely protect the borders of his homeland, they took on a lot more credibility under his successor, Charles V. And it is Charles V who we will take a closer look at next episode, which will also be the last of this season. I hope you will join us again. And in the meantime, do not forget that the History of the Germans only works and works advertising free if enough of you support the show by going to historyofthegermans.com/support and make a free contribution. And this is what Kim, Michael S., Brian A., Tor H., Andrew G., William C.H. and Bloke in North Dorset have done, and we should all thank them for their generosity.